When you think of medieval justice, what comes to mind? Perhaps a dimly lit dungeon, iron maidens gleaming in torchlight, racks creaking under the weight of screaming victims, and hooded executioners turning wheels of agony. Hollywood has sold us this vision so effectively that we've come to accept it as historical fact. But what if I told you that the medieval torture chamber, as you imagine it, never really existed? That most of the devices we associate with medieval punishment were either vastly exaggerated, used far less frequently than we think, or outright fabricated centuries after the Middle Ages ended. The reality of medieval justice was far more mundane and, in some ways, far more disturbing than any horror film could capture. Because the true horror wasn't in elaborate machines of pain. It was in the systematic, bureaucratic, and utterly public nature of how societies enforced order through shame, fear, and the spectacle of punishment. Today, we're examining the historical reality behind medieval punishment, separating documented legal practices from sensationalized myth, and understanding how these systems actually functioned in their cultural context. What you'll discover is that medieval justice wasn't about sadism, it was about social control, public deterrence, and extracting what authorities believed to be divine truth through human intervention. Medieval law operated on fundamentally different principles than modern justice. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, no standardized rules of evidence. Instead, justice served three primary functions: extracting confession, reinforcing social hierarchy, and creating public spectacles that deterred others from criminal behavior. Punishment was primarily about rehabilitation or even retribution. In the modern sense. It was about maintaining order in societies where centralized authority was weak and local communities needed visible demonstrations of consequences. This is where public punishment devices became essential tools of medieval governance, and contrary to popular imagination, the most common instruments of justice weren't designed to kill or maim, they were designed to humiliate. Consider the stocks and pillory, perhaps the most ubiquitous punishment devices in medieval Europe. These wooden restraints appeared in virtually every town square across the continent. The stock secured a person's ankles while they sat on the ground. The pillory was more severe, it locked the head and hands while the victim stood, forcing them to remain upright for hours or days. These devices weren't torture instruments in the way we understand the term. They were mechanisms of social shaming for minor offenses: public drunkenness, petty theft, selling underweight bread, or watering down ale. The punishment wasn't the physical restraint itself, but the public exposure that accompanied it. The convicted person became a spectacle, positioned in the busiest part of town where neighbors, customers, and strangers could see them in disgrace. And citizens were encouraged to participate. Passers-by would throw rotten food, mud, or excrement. They would shout insults, mock the prisoner, remind them of their sins against the community. This wasn't random cruelty, it was orchestrated social enforcement. The community collectively demonstrated that certain behaviors violated shared norms, and the punishment reinforced those boundaries through ritualized humiliation. The psychological impact was profound. In tight-knit medieval communities where reputation determined economic survival and social standing, public shaming could destroy a person's livelihood more effectively than any fine or imprisonment. A baker pilloried for selling short-weight bread might find customers refusing his goods long after the punishment ended. A merchant in the stocks for fraud might lose business relationships that took years to build. The gendered nature of medieval punishment becomes especially apparent when examining devices like the scold's bridle, also called the brank mask. This iron cage enclosed a woman's head, with a metal plate that pressed down on her tongue, sometimes with spikes that would cause pain if she attempted to speak. It was specifically designed for women accused of being scolds, those who gossiped, nagged, quarreled with neighbors, or otherwise violated medieval expectations of feminine silence and submission. The scold's bridle reveals how punishment enforced not just legal order, but social hierarchy. Men accused of similar verbal offenses might be fined or briefly placed in stocks. Women faced a device that physically prevented speech while marking them publicly as transgressors of gender norms. The victim would be paraded through town, the metal cage visible to all, before being secured in a public location where neighbors could observe her silenced state. This wasn't about crime in any modern sense. It was about controlling women who challenged patriarchal authority through speech. The punishment was both physical discomfort and profound social messaging. This is what happens to women who speak too freely. But these public shaming devices represented only one aspect of medieval justice. To understand how the system evolved toward more invasive methods, we must examine a crucial transition in European legal philosophy during the 13th century. For much of the early Middle Ages, disputed cases were often resolved through trial by ordeal procedures like holding hot iron, being submerged in water, or consuming blessed bread without choking. These methods assumed divine intervention would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. Justice belonged to God, not human judgment. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 prohibited clergy from participating in trials by ordeal, removing religious sanction from these practices. This created a crisis in legal procedure. If God would no longer reveal truth through miraculous intervention, how could courts determine guilt? The answer that emerged was judicial torture, the systematic application of pain to extract confession, which was considered the highest form of evidence. This shift was fundamental. Justice moved from divine revelation to human-administered procedure, and that procedure required tools, regulations, and systematic methods for extracting what authorities now defined as truth through confession. The devices we associate with medieval torture emerged not from random sadism, but from this legal transformation, the bureaucratization of confession extraction in service of what authorities believed was legitimate judicial process. Now we turn to the devices that dominate popular imagination, the instruments that appear in every medieval horror story and torture museum. Here's where history and mythology diverge most dramatically, because most of what you think you know about these devices is wrong. Let's begin with perhaps the most famous torture device in history, the rack. This wooden frame consisted of a rectangular platform with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists and ankles were bound to the rollers, which were then turned, stretching the body. The rack appears in countless films, novels, and historical accounts as the quintessential torture device of the Middle Ages. But here's what popular accounts rarely mention. The rack was heavily regulated, rarely used, and often ineffective for its stated purpose. In England, where the rack was most famously employed, its use required authorization from the Privy Council or the monarch directly. It wasn't a tool available to local magistrates or petty officials. The Tower of London, the most notorious location for rack use, maintained detailed records, and those records show the device was employed only in cases of suspected treason or threats to state security, not common criminal matters. Moreover, confessions obtained under torture were legally problematic even in medieval and early modern law. Authorities recognized that extreme pain would make people confess to anything, true or not. Many legal systems required that confessions extracted under duress be freely repeated afterward, without torture, to be considered valid evidence. This didn't prevent torture's use, but it did create legal frameworks that acknowledged its unreliability. The rack's reputation far exceeds its actual historical use. It existed, certainly, but it functioned more as a threat, a psychological weapon whose mere presence could induce cooperation, than as a routine judicial tool. The reality of medieval interrogation was far more likely to involve isolation, intimidation, threatened torture, and exhaustion than actual application of devices like the rack. Now let's address the most iconic torture device in popular imagination, the Iron Maiden. This upright sarcophagus lined with inward-facing spikes would supposedly impale a victim when the door closed, causing agonizing death. The image is horrifying, memorable, and completely fabricated. The most famous Iron Maiden, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was constructed in the early 19th century, roughly 500 years after the medieval period ended. It was created specifically for a commercial museum of medieval punishment, designed to attract paying customers who wanted to experience the thrilling horror of the supposedly barbaric past. There is no credible evidence that Iron Maidens existed during the actual Middle Ages. No contemporary medieval sources describe such devices. No archaeological evidence supports their use. The entire concept appears to have been invented during the Romantic era of the 18th and 19th centuries, when Europeans became fascinated with and simultaneously horrified by their own history. This is crucial to understand. Many of the devices we associate with medieval torture were actually created centuries later to satisfy public appetite for sensationalized history. Exhibition halls in Victorian-era Europe displayed authentic medieval torture instruments that were actually modern fabrications, constructed to match popular assumptions about how barbaric the past must have been. The Iron Maiden represents our collective need to believe that the past was more brutal than the present, that we have progressed from savagery to civilization. But this narrative is more comfortable mythology than documented history. The Judas cradle presents a similar problem of dubious provenance. This device supposedly consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat mounted on a post. The victim would be suspended above it and slowly lowered onto the point, causing severe internal injury. Descriptions of its use appear in various historical accounts, particularly from the Spanish Inquisition. But when historians examine primary source documents, actual court records, administrative accounts, contemporary descriptions, solid evidence for the Judas cradle becomes remarkably scarce. References appear primarily in later secondary sources, often written centuries after the fact by authors with particular agendas. Protestant writers depicting Catholic brutality, Enlightenment authors demonstrating medieval ignorance, or sensationalist historians selling books to audiences hungry for Gothic horror. This doesn't mean the device never existed. It means we should be skeptical of how frequently it was used and whether it functioned as dramatically as later accounts suggest. Many descriptions of torture devices from this period suffer from the same problem. They appear in literature, propaganda, and sensationalized accounts far more often than in actual administrative records or legal proceedings. The overarching truth is this: the medieval torture chamber as a concept is largely a myth, popularized by Gothic literature, sensationalist museums, and horror entertainment centuries after the medieval period ended. When actual medieval and early modern torture occurred, it was usually far more mundane: whipping, beating, branding, or other common punishments that didn't require elaborate mechanical devices. The worst brutality wasn't found in Iron Maidens or racks. It was found in everyday punishments: public floggings that could cripple or kill, brandings that marked criminals permanently, mutilations like cutting off ears or hands that served as permanent visible warnings. These common punishments are far less famous than the elaborate devices, precisely because they're less theatrical and therefore less marketable to audiences seeking Gothic thrills. This reveals something important about how we construct historical narratives. We're drawn to spectacular horror. The more elaborate and shocking, the better the story, but real history is often more banal. Real medieval justice was bureaucratic, public, and designed to maintain social order through visible consequences and communal participation in punishment. The devices of legend tell us more about the fears and fascinations of the people who invented or exaggerated them, often centuries after the medieval period, than about actual medieval legal practice. So, what should we take away from this examination? Medieval punishment was real, often harsh, and deeply embedded in social structures that modern people would find oppressive and unjust. But the popular image of medieval torture chambers filled with elaborate machines of agony is largely fiction, constructed by later generations who needed to believe their ancestors were more savage than themselves. True historical understanding requires us to separate documented evidence from sensationalized mythology, to examine power structures and legal systems, rather than fixating on spectacular violence, and to recognize that the stories we tell about the past often serve present needs for moral superiority or entertaining horror. The Dark Ages weren't nearly as dark as we've been told, but they were complex, alien, and operating under assumptions about justice, truth, and social order that we can barely comprehend from our modern perspective. And that complexity, that strangeness, is far more interesting than any Iron Maiden. If this examination of medieval justice challenged what you thought you knew about history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment letting me know what other historical myths you'd like me to investigate. I'm fascinated by how far these evidence-based historical examinations can reach in cutting through centuries of misinformation. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know, because history is always more complicated than the stories we tell about it.